All right, good evening, everyone. We are looking at Esther 8, 9 through 10. So if you turn there in your notes, it's page 122. 122. Now we're getting into the part of the narrative where there's a counter decree. And this is meant to parallel, of course, Haman's decree in Esther. And this is kind of an interesting thing here when you look at this, because again, we know that the Persian rulers, they couldn't just say, oh, you know what, I made a mistake, nor would they. I made a mistake, I'm going to rescind that law that I just passed. You couldn't do that. And it was essentially irrevocable. There are certain instances where, some people abuse that, but essentially it couldn't be undone. And so now, if you couldn't undo it, then you had to make a counter decree that would match provision for provision and try to nullify and neutralize the first one. And that's essentially what we're going to see here. But before we begin, let's make sure that we are in fellowship, prepare to study. And one of the things, of course, we should be asking God for every day is wisdom, divine wisdom, not just wisdom, how best to do a Sudoku puzzle, New York Times crossword, or anything like that. I mean, if you want to pray about that, whatever. But what we're talking about here is divine wisdom, God's Bible doctrine. And so here James speaks of this. But if any of you lacks wisdom, and by the way, we all do, we have not reached a point where we can't learn anything else. So this applies to all of us. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. And this is an interesting part in this verse. I've always liked this, that not only does God give you generously, I mean, if you really want wisdom, he's going to give it to you in abundance. But also, this is important, without reproach. So this is the idea here that he's not going to scold you if you're asking for something you've already been taught and you should already know. Because if we've been, trying to learn doctrine for years and years, there's certain doctrines, obviously, that we just need constant review. We should know better. Yeah, okay, God knows this, but he's still going to give us this wisdom and do so without reproach. In essence, he's not scolding us. You should already know this. I'm not going to tell you anymore or anything like that. No, he keeps it up. As long as we want to have this wisdom, he's going to give it to us. And that is the case for all, believers that aspire, positive volition, and aspire to the wreath. He continues, when you're asking for wisdom, and actually this is a great principle for any of your prayers. So here in verse 6, but let him ask in faith without any doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. If you're approaching God in prayer, which you should be, but you're approaching him with doubt or reluctance or uncertainty as to his capability or ability to deal with your life circumstances, you have issues. We all do. We have all succumbed to doubts at certain points. But understand this, that we have to ask God for things. Here, wisdom is in view, but anything you ask God for, do so with faith, confident that he will deliver, and he can as well. Whether or not he's going to give you your exact request, that remains to be seen. We just looked at Paul and the demon. He did not answer Paul's request in the affirmative. As a matter of fact, he denied Paul's request to spare him from this affliction. And instead he said to Paul, your weakness here, it doesn't matter. I'm paraphrasing. But my strength is demonstrated in your weakness. And what that means is that he would sustain Paul like he does for us as well. So it's a great thing. But anyway, part of this is getting wisdom. And part of the way that God gives us wisdom is when we assemble in Bible class here. We must do so in fellowship so we can properly take in the words. So take a few moments, rebound if you need to. And I'll begin with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Father, thank you for this opportunity we have tonight to study the book of Esther. I pray that you would bless this Bible class to our further spiritual advancement. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Okay. So here in Esther 9 through 10, We see here in 7 and 8, actually, that's where we finished on Sunday. So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked." So basically, as I mentioned, he's offloading this responsibility. Now action, in a positive sense, action is now being taken to remedy this situation, to try to nullify Haman's decree. And so with this, we see in verses 9 through 10, "So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every language according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on the steeds, sired by the royal stud." Kind of interesting, the detail here, but we'll see here. It's kind of like what Haman did, Mordecai can do better. And you'll see this along, and again, understand who's writing this. Well, we don't know exactly, but it's a Jew. And so this is something that he's demonstrating too, that Haman was, he was outdone in every single way. And that includes even the horses and the couriers. We'll take a look at that. So it's kind of interesting there. But the analysis of 9 through 10 here. 1, the king's scribes are called in to write the counter decree. 2, our author indicates this occurred on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, Sivan. 3, Sivan only occurs here in the Old Testament and is a Babylonian month name adopted by the Jews during the Babylonian exile. So here, Sivan, again, only here in the Old Testament in Scripture. And this was pretty common during the Babylonian exile. The Jews adopted, certain things. Oh, not all the Jews came back too. Of course, we know that. Even up until recently, by the way, there was a large Jewish presence in that area. Up until prior to World War II. And then, of course, the rise of Islam, that is not good for being a Jew or a Christian, well, anyone, unless you're Islamic. It wasn't good for you when they came into power. But there was a mass exodus of Jews out of there in particular. And so, but for a long time, they adopted some of the customs and they adopted some of the language, of course, of where they were. 4, the writing of the counter decree occurs about 2 months and 10 days after Haman's original decree was put into effect. Esther 3:12, turn over to chapter 3. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the 1st month. It was written just as Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princes of each people, each province according to its script, each people according to its language, and being written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Right away, you can see it's very similar and sometimes exact language used that Mordecai is now using in his counter decree in response to Haman's decree. 13, and letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. So here, this is about 2 months after, 2 months and 10 days after Haman's original decree, just to give you some idea of the time frame here. 5, at this point in the narrative, Mordecai begins to play a more prominent role. So we've seen him, he's one of the primary characters, but up to this point, you have Esther, who of course is the main character, along with King Ahasuerus and so forth. And now Mordecai is, as we see appropriately, he's been elevated as one of the king's administrators to now the basically prime minister second in command here with the signet ring. The king has already given him that ring to wield royal authority. I mean, we know the king likes to not really be responsible for certain things, but this is not something you would just do for anyone. You wouldn't just give him the ring. So, in one sense, we talk about the flakiness and evil, of Ahasuerus, and that is appropriate. But understand this, that he did, at least on a certain level, have a great deal of trust in Mordecai. And it was, remember, in the back of his mind too, he knows that Mordecai actually saved his life. Remember, he prevented an assassination plot too. So, there was a high degree of trust here, at least of Ahasuerus, of Mordecai. Now, you wouldn't want to trust Ahasuerus, for he could be all over the place and so forth. But at least we see with the king, he gave Mordecai the ring. So Mordecai begins to play a more prominent role. Now, 6, he is now the king's advisor, wielding royal authority. 7, the counter decree was distributed throughout the entire Persian Empire in all 127 provinces. So it was massive. And I forgot to put the graphic up. Let me just see here. Bear with me. The resolution isn't the greatest, but let's see here. So here gives you some idea anyway, at least if you can't read some of the smaller script, look at where the red is. And over to the left of the screen, this is essentially the Persian Empire extending into Africa. So you have Ethiopia and then modern day, in Egypt, and also parts of Libya, modern day Libya as well. And then you look over to the far right, it's into modern day India. And then it was just massive. So this is where, again, Haman's original edict went out to all these places. Now, this counter decree has to go out to the same places. All the provinces, 127 provinces throughout the empire. And all these people, of course, they spoke their own language. They had their own written language as well, for the most part. So this was quite a task, an administrative task, but just the knowledge, how many scribes and the knowledge of the scribes, that everyone, regardless of language or people, they would have to know, this as well. So quite an undertaking here, but it was essentially taken out. It would be like, if you study U.S. history in the Pony Express, where that's how you distributed mail way back in the day. Probably faster than it is today. Anyway, that's all another thing. But it is a matter of they had different stations of horses, and so they were able to go and relatively quickly, hence the express part of the Pony Express. And so when we talk about here too, the riders being on royal steeds and so forth, so they were actually on some of the king's best horses to accomplish all of this. And they would be in great condition, top prime condition, and super fast. So they wanted to, as we will discuss, they wanted to do this as quickly as possible. But anyway, here in point 7, the counter decree was distributed throughout the entire Persian Empire in all 127 provinces. 8, every inhabitant would know its contents as they had Haman's decree. Now 9, the Jews in particular were notified since the original decree called for their destruction. So they're singled out here, everyone, but in particular the Jews as well, as where it says here in verse 9, at the end of verse 9, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language as well. You might think, well, Jews, didn't they all speak Hebrew or whatever? No, they didn't. And there's one of the other things too, I've used this as an example. If you've ever spent any time in the South, well, it sounds like a different language sometimes. And they're speaking English, but sometimes you cannot understand them. And I'm sure they feel the same way, if they come up to New York. It's one of those things. And what this leads to or means is that we have different dialects. You're speaking English, but I'll never forget one time too. We were in San Francisco. This was a number of years ago, and we were riding this trolley car. It was really cool, nice night and so forth. It was packed, and we're going up right by the Lombard Street, really steep area. And anyway, long story short, all of a sudden the trolley stops, and I was like, oh, well, it stopped at a very picturesque place. It was a nice evening, so it wasn't too bad. But I was sitting next to a guy that at first I thought he was speaking a foreign language. Okay, and long story short, it was a father and the son from England. And they were not just from jolly old England in London or anything where you can pretty much understand what they're saying. They're from the north of England. And if you've never heard anyone from the north in certain areas, it's like, wow. But anyway, so I'm talking to him, and I remember he was looking at me, and I saw his mouth moving, and I couldn't understand what he was saying, And then it was the weirdest thing. It's like a switch flipped in my mind. And, oh, he's speaking English. And then it was weird. Once you got the dialect, then you could focus in on what he was saying. But I'll never forget that, too. I felt that way, too. Sometimes people in the South, different dialect, and it's very hard to understand. And they use their own little colloquialisms and so forth, expressions. So this is what you have here. You have this edict. I mean, it's just being, disseminated to everyone in each dialect that you have out there. So everyone was put on notice, just like with Haman's. Everyone was put on notice with that. So everyone was put on notice with this counter decree. Mordecai acted under royal authority. He wrote in the name of the king and sealed the decree with the king's signet ring. Of course, if we think about this, right, sometimes we understand if you're sealing a letter, not so much anymore, but used to be you could seal a letter with wax. You get hot wax, put it on a letter, and then put your stamp in there, and it might have, say, your initials or, something like that. Well, this would be a something that was only exclusive to the king. So let's just say, if, they sealed it such as that, it would be sealed with the king's. It's basically a signature. And this carried the full weight and authority of the throne. And so that's the kind of power, that Mordecai had here. But once that was done, it couldn't be undone. 11, he then distributed the decree by couriers. Now 12, the author provides a detail. The horses ridden by the couriers. 13, the horses selected for this task were from the royal herd, which undoubtedly were in top condition. Like I said here, the author, we just read an account of Haman's original decree, and what it says is that the couriers went out. Well, you understand, okay, the couriers here. But now you see here the couriers have horses, and not just any horses, but the best horses. So this is kind of like and they're going to do it presumably faster than Haman as well. It's not a matter of just one-upmanship, which is really, Haman, or rather Mordecai is doing this in a more organized way and faster, but time is of the essence here, as we will see. Again, we have till the month of Adar. So we have several months before this first decree, but you're going to need all this time. The Jews will. Verses 11 through 12. In them, the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. So the last month, as we've just said, this is Adar, and so this is the day. Translation is good. These, by the way, in the narrative here, these translations are pretty basic, so there's no need to change them up much. The analysis of verses 11 through 12. The author reveals the provisions of the counter decree distributed throughout the empire. 2, at first glance, the decree grants the Jews the right of self-defense. Now 3, we may infer that the Jews would have attempted to defend themselves even without a decree. Now, when I first looked at this, it's like, well, all right, Well, of course, they can defend themselves. Then looking at this further in some of the vocabulary, well, it's more significant than just that. So 4, yet upon further examination, the significance of the rights granted the Jews comes to light. 5, the chief provision stipulates that the Jews who are in each and every city the right to assemble. Now we might think, that's the thing, when you approach this context from the American mindset, right? We understand we have the right to assemble, free speech, all these different things. We take this, it's part of our, part of our heritage, if you will. And but this was a big deal for what this meant. I mean, obviously people could assemble and people in a certain limited way. But when you look at the terminology here, 6, our term translated assemble connotes the right to form an army or armies. So our understanding of assembling is not this. We do not have the right, if we just decided today at Faith Bible Church, we're going to begin to form an army and we're going to go door to door and all of that. No, that wouldn't happen for a number of reasons. First of all, it would be wrong. However, here, our term assemble, rather than just gathering in a group for the purpose of self-defense, this is something larger. They could, if they desired, again, all these provinces, 127 provinces, all the Jews in here, they could form an army of potentially a vast army. So this connotes the right to form an army or armies. This verb kahal, look at 1 Samuel 17:47. So we look at, I should say I do, but we have to, look at the various occurrences of this word kahal. And when you see it, it can mean an assembly, like a congregation. Like sometimes, like in the Old Testament, right, various passages deal with the assembly, versus dealing with, like say, I was in ruin in the midst of the assembly or congregation or something. It does have that kind of connotation that it could be a gathering, a group of people, and in this case, the Jews. But you see in other instances here in the purpose of self-defense, all right, this term here connotes an army. And you see here in the context of David and Goliath, what is happening here? Well, you have the armies of Israel, the army of Israel opposing the army of the Philistines. We know this. So you essentially have two assemblies, or you have two groups that have assembled together, and they are armies. We make no mistake about this. So here, as David is getting ready to go into battle, and here, verse 44, the Philistine also said to David, come to me and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with the sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I'll give the dead body, pretty graphic here, give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly, this is our term here, kahal, may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So here the assembly, it actually incorporates two armies. In this case, the assembly of the Jews, which is the armies of Israel, the assembly of the Philistines, the army that was supporting Goliath. Ezekiel 38:15. So this is referring to the end times. And without going into all of that, verse 15, actually 14, therefore prophesy, son of man, and say to Gog, thus says the Lord God, on that day when my people Israel are living securely, will you not know of it? And you will come from your place out of the remote parts of the north, you and your many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great assembly and a mighty army. Here, assembly, this is an army, and obviously this is used as somewhat in a parallel sense, where synonymous parallelism, where great assembly is the equivalent of a mighty army. So it's pretty clear here. Anyway, our term kahal means to, here in our Esther context, the right to form an army or armies. And I say armies plural because it's a vast empire. So you could have a number of Jewish armies. 7, to form an army without royal approval will be viewed as rebellion. So if we decided, using my terrible example, if we decided to form an army in the army of West Babylon, or Greater Babylon, or something like that, well, you know, if we decided to go about armed insurrection because we're just unhappy, then this is actually sedition, this is rebellion. And the Constitution has specific, just regular civil law forbids this. And more importantly, most importantly, God's law, by the way, prohibits this. So if you've been following the news, okay, I have actually heard statements, read statements that those who would support the sitting president are ready to take up arms. And all he has to do is make the call. That's according to some individuals. Now, you can't just take the word of some individuals here and say all people are like this, but there is definitely a vocal, seditious component to this. So this is an interesting time in our democracy. There's been a lot said about this, but just so you know, here, now the Jews can form an army, and it's not going to be an act of sedition because they're not, you know, it should be obvious they're not going to oppose the government. And obviously, Ahasuerus doesn't fear the fact that, okay, well, what if they, you know, I allow them to form armies and they kill the enemies, and then they come after me? I mean, could they disrupt the empire? And he never fears this, that we're aware of at all. He has complete trust in Mordecai in this. And besides that, you know, he might think too that there's nothing they could do against the might of Persian arms anyway. And that's entirely correct in this particular case. But this is something, though, that they are given the right to do this. So 8, the Jews would now have the capability sanctioned by the king to assemble armies without restrictions. As far as we know, there's no number limit placed on this. It could be thousands and thousands. I tend to believe it was. We don't know exact numbers, but the amount of people we will see that were killed by the Jews would suggest that these armies, there were thousands and thousands. So, imagine that, you know. 9, although it is not clear what role, if any, the Persian armies would have played in carrying out Haman's decree, the counter decree renders them a non-factor. I find this interesting too when we think of keeping the peace in the empire. Obviously, that would be part of the function of the Persian armies, right? So, you know, we don't have any mention before really of their role, if any, so we don't know. But what this does do, though, is effectively puts them on the sideline. They are not going to participate. The only way they would participate, since this counter decree is sanctioned by the king, they would actually side on behalf of the Jews. Now, we don't know, but if any of these Persian generals or whatever, if they had any intent whatsoever of thinking, well, you know, listen, maybe I could kill some Jews here, maybe think of this, maybe out in some of these remote provinces, right, away from Susa and the king, they think, well, if I kill these Jews, remember, I get money. I get whatever they have. I get the spoil. I get the plunder. So, hey, do a little freelance work here on the side. It's one day. We'll kill these Jews. I'm going to take their homes and their riches, and we're good. No one will know anymore. We're way out here. Who would bother us out in this backwater, wherever, out in the Persian Empire? You never know that I'm sure that there are certain generals and leaders that would have this as well. Of course, these orders went out to the satraps, governors, all the officials, so everyone was put on notice. So they were rendered really a non-factor in this 10. Those who intended to profit from the annihilation of the Jews are put on notice. Think again, what you want to do here. 11, the Jews are given the right to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them. Blank check. So if you oppose the Jews, now you have a few months to think about this. Of course, they had their enemies, and they are dealt with, as we will see in the next chapter. 12, we see the provisions of the counter decree parallel those written by Haman. Turn back again. We read it, but just to 3:13, Esther 3:13. So the letters here, the first decree by Haman, sent out by couriers to all the king's provinces. And here the language: to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day. And of course, to seize their possessions. This is very important. These provisions in this first decree are then, countered by Mordecai's. So we see the provisions of the counter decree parallel those written by Haman. 13, it was intended to neutralize all the provisions of the original decree. 14, both decrees allow for seizing plunder and for the killing of women and children. This is one of the things when you go into this verse, see, this is one of the pitfalls. If you go into studying the Bible, it's like what we talked about, right? If you came into Esther thinking Esther was pure as gold, just pure in every sense, and was the ultimate heroine and didn't do anything wrong, and Mordecai too, you'd be absolutely mistaken. That's not the reality of what you see in Esther. So here, some people, they have problems with this. The Jews are now going to kill. They take this as being, they're going to kill women and children too. And this is something you have to look at this. Again, this is why I stress Haman's original decree allowed for this. So the counter decree is meant to match every provision, to allow for that if they are attacked. Now, this is something that is unpleasant to think about. But then again, you have to think here too that God, and in the case of the Amalekites, what did he say as an example? Kill them all. And this was, again, because of the sins they committed against the Jews, and also cursing by association. And so this was something that was carried out. So, this type of order wouldn't be unusual. Also, the mindset here, here's the thing. Okay, if we get out of our current mindset here in the 20th century or whatever it is, 21st century, and in the U.S. in our modern times and so forth, right? And we go back in the ancient Near East, okay, which we can't do, but we're going to try to do. And you think, if I have enemies, okay, just in a mercenary point of view, if I kill just my enemy, then, okay, you've killed your enemy, right? But what about if they have family? Well, then they take up the grudge, right? We think of, in our modern days, of honor killing and so forth. If you kill someone, then someone's obliged to do all this. That's actually very ancient as well. So there would still be or we might think Hatfields and McCoys, right? What did they ever fight about? It doesn't matter. They just killing each other, and because you killed, someone, then we have to kill one of you and all that. So from the mindset of, if you really want to eliminate your enemies, what do you have to do? Or what was one option that many many did. Well, you kill the whole family. You kill everyone. Then you don't have any enemies. You do not have your immediate enemy, and you make sure you're not going to have any future enemies because there's no one left alive. Now, I know that's pretty, that's brutal, but that's how certain people thought. And I'm not saying that, like with, God's sanctions and so forth, this was due to sin of the Amalekites, but just in general, and in thinking of the time, and that's foreign to us. That's like, wow, that's terrible. Okay, well, this is where what you have to look at if you're going to study when this is written, and actually the readers or the listeners of Esther would understand this as well. This would not be, troubling to them morally and so forth. I mean, they would understand this. And by the way, as we will see, the Jews actually restrained themselves. As far as we know, maybe some women and children were killed, but when you look at the text, it's clear that men were killed. Primarily singled out, and what's really prominent, they didn't take any plunder. Although that was the original decree from Haman, that these enemies of the Jews, they could take anything they wanted. To the victor goes the spoils. Well, the Jews were victorious, but they refused to take plunder. So. "15, essentially the Jews were given the right to annihilate all who might attack them." And I do mean annihilate. When in our modern day too, we have the Geneva Convention. We have rules of combat. You can't, in some theaters of operations, even now and in the past, you can only fire or respond to an enemy if they fired at you. I mean, that's the most ridiculous thing. You just hope they're a poor shot, and it's just, but that's crazy. That's how you want to fight a war. That's not how you fight a war. And a lot of that is with UN peacekeeping operations and all that bunk that is, not appropriate anyway. But now you see this is total war. Annihilate them. If they're going to be your enemy, and they're going to attack you, this is not responding to those people that are not your enemies or attacking without provocation. This is a direct response to attack on you, self-defense. You annihilate them. So this is what occurred, but they were given this right, again, by the king, to deal with their enemies. 16, we will see the Jews refrained from taking plunder, and there's no mention of killing women and children. Turn over to Esther 9:6. So this day that we're looking forward to here in the future from our context is now, this is the day. Okay? This is the time when the Jews are going to war against their enemies. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. This doesn't mean like they tortured them and and all this. They annihilated. They had their way. Completely annihilated them. And in Susa, the capital, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. So, and here you have men. And in this case, as we will deal with, the sons of Haman. So this is one of the things too. Why did you kill all your enemies and their enemies' families sometimes? Because now, okay, Haman was dead. Did that leave the issue, was the issue fine? No, absolutely not. His sons were enemies of the Jews too. And they wanted to avenge their father. And they weren't successful at all. Here in verse 10, or rather, verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy, they killed them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Then we see in 15 and 16, and the Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now we'll deal with this, but notice here in 15. This is the 14th day. This is an extra day. So this is an extra day, a bonus day, if you will, to deal with the Jews' enemies because it was still going on. So remember now, Mordecai's edict called for the 13th. Now this is the 14th. So they assembled on the 14th day of the month Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. And 16, now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated him, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. So, this is the reality here, but they refrained from taking plunder, and the emphasis here at least is, again, not that any women and children didn't die, but the emphasis here is that the men were killed. So, and the Bible, it does mention when women and children are killed too, so. 17, this was to occur on the 13th of Adar, the 12th month in all the provinces. Here, this is the same as Haman's decree as we've seen. 18, our context deals with violence in the form of self-defense as a response to aggression. Here, violence used to counter predatory violence. This is predatory violence. Haman's original edict. "19, for the believer, self-defense is a non-sinful form of violence." This is lost on a lot of people. When you have believers that are objecting to their conscientious objectors, they object to capital punishment and so forth, you have a believer that doesn't understand the Bible and actual judicious doctrinal use of violence. And that's also very important to understand too, because we do live in violent times. And so, obviously it's hard to miss that gun sales, by the way, have gone through the roof. This pandemic and the unrest that we've had as a nation been an incredible bonus for manufacturers and everything. They're out of stock, as a matter of fact, in many cases. So why on earth would you have a run on guns? And by the way, this is not just right-wing people going into these shops buying guns. This is everyone, all walks of life. People feel unsafe. Why would they feel unsafe? Well, we have civil unrest. We have actual occurrences and the perceived possibility of violence being inflicted upon you. Predatory violence. So what do you want to do? You buy a weapon, a rifle. And obviously in our nation, that's your constitutional right to defend yourself. And you can, at least, you have to pay attention. Of course, I always say this, the laws within New York override the Constitution in certain cases, in the sense that you can't just go buy any old firearm like a machine gun or something like that, like you can have in other states. No, but you can buy firearms to defend yourself, and that's your prerogative as well. And there's a reason why people are going out in mass buying all these guns, because they fear the threat of violence upon themselves. So 19, for the believer, self-defense is a non-sinful form of violence. 20, we live in violent times, and it's important to be grounded in a correct understanding of violence in various circumstances. 21, we are not to resort to simple violence or any old sin nature activity to resolve various circumstances we encounter in the cosmos. Now, I don't know if you watched some of the protests and so forth, but you had on both sides, if you will, sinful violence. Okay, I'm not saying necessarily on the point of law enforcement. What I am saying, in particular, one case was that you had some individuals, I forget exactly where, they're defending a business. I think it was a gas station or whatever, and I think a young guy, he's like 18, I think. I want to say it was Michigan, but I could be wrong. He ends up killing someone and shooting him, and it's all caught right there on tape. It's very, very graphic. And so the debate is, did he defend himself? Is this lawful? Or did he gun someone down? Valid question when you look at this. So, if you go out and pursue someone, or, the thing is, he's in a situation where in many cases he should not have been engaging with some of the protesters, and then he gets assaulted. Why you would want to assault someone with a semi-automatic is beyond me, but someone, it's not like we're dealing with the sharpest marbles here, or they're sharp as a marble, I should say, sharpest tools in the shed. And so you attack him, the young man, teenager, fires some rounds off and kills a guy. So what is this? Is this right or wrong? So that's the big debate and everything. And so there's a lot of questions with that. The fact that he could carry, as far as I understand, it was lawfully purchased and all these things. So, but that's for the authorities and to prosecute and deal with. But the fact is that we do in our society have the right to defend ourselves, but you have to be careful how you do it. It's discernment. Just like the Jews, they couldn't kill everyone. Like, you looked at me wrong, you're dead, and just start pursuing personal vendettas or whatever. No, if they were attacked, by their enemies, then they could deal with their enemies. So, anyway, this is where we're going to stop tonight. We'll finish this up tomorrow night. And other non-simple violence, like I said, capital punishment. If you've read in the news too, there's a couple of states. I thought it was interesting. Usually now, if you're executed, it's lethal injection. But now a couple of states, because we obviously have to balance federal law and state law. So there was a federal mandate, I think, that ran out, and so that now certain states have the option. You can do lethal injection. You can also, if you would like, if you're going to be executed, you can choose to be executed by firing squad or hung now. So this is, I don't know. I've never been in that situation where you get that kind of pick, I don't, but that is part of the reality here in the judicial process when you're dealing with certain defenders where you have righteous violence. As a matter of fact, this is commanded by God for a nation to execute criminals that demand it, murderers as an example. But that's all another thing. But to do that in and of itself, capital punishment is not morally wrong at all. I mean, this is a basic thing. Believers are tripped up on this all the time. So it's not saying that you don't know this. You should. But if you have any doubts or qualms about the right to keep and bear arms, that's under attack as well. Well, you need to get over it. I mean, this is a constitutional right, and it has been argued, but unsuccessfully, and it's been struck down by the Supreme Court. But you have this, and actually, even so, if you want to say Jesus Christ himself told his disciples to arm themselves, so right there you have a mandate. Why would he do that? Well, the reality is that, look around. The human race is full of violence, okay? And that is from the get-go. Cain and Abel, what happened? Violence, all right? And from that point, we have all of this. And so defend yourselves and so forth, and these types, of course, that do kill, murder rather, not all killing, but murder in particular, need to be executed. Anyway, we'll look at this. But I find this is obviously a very, very important subject now that we need to be up on, and a lot of people are unsure. And even if you're not, even if you grasp all these, good for you, because you may run into someone though that needs some clarification from the biblical viewpoint. And some people just might think it's morally wrong and all this. Well, people think a lot of things, and since we're in the devil's world, people think a lot of things that are against Bible doctrine. So you have the opportunity and privilege really to set the record straight. Not that they'll accept it, but you can give them the truth. And that's all you can do. So, especially in these confusing times. Again, we live in a time when people are in crisis, all right? And you have the answers. So this is a great position to be in. Things are not good on any stretch, in many cases throughout our society. So this, again, has people examining themselves, questioning themselves. Why are things the way they are? I mean, we know there's a virus and everything, but just what this has sparked, and people are so distraught and they lack satisfaction, all these different things. When you have a virus, that's in general on a good day, on a good period of human history, right? But now when you have all these other factors, an election that's been contentious, you have a pandemic, then it just makes it worse. But you then can step in and say, hey, look, yeah, all these things are indeed happening, but here's the truth. And you can actually, rather than be troubled, you can actually be tranquil. And this is the thing too, as a believer, that you need to be tranquil in the midst of all this nonsense that's going on. So, something to think about though, but we'll pick this up tomorrow night. Father, thank you for this opportunity and privilege we have to study your Bible doctrine. I pray that we be anchored to it and glorify you as we disseminate it to whoever might come in our periphery. I pray that we glorify you in these last days. In Christ's name I pray, amen.